Welcome, everybody. Welcome to this Parliamentary CND launch event entitled Nuclear Weapons Are Banned. What does this mean for Britain? Almost exactly a year ago, the UN's Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons came into force. This was a groundbreaking development in global steps towards nuclear disarmament. But what does it mean for the world? And in particular, what does it mean for Britain? Today, CND is delighted to be launching a substantive report on this new treaty and its implications for British nuclear policies. The report is available now on the CND website, and I can say that it's exceptionally detailed, rigorous, and comprehensive. I think it's going to be of great value to all those working in this area, not only for activists, but particularly for parliamentarians and policymakers. We've got a very distinguished panel of speakers this afternoon to look at the report, assess its value, and give us some tasters of what we might expect to find within it. First of all, we're going to hear from the report's author, Dr. Rebecca Johnson. Rebecca is a renowned expert on nuclear treaties, and she was involved in the TPNW negotiations. We're also going to hear from the UK's Disarmament Ambassador in Geneva, Aidan Liddle, who's going to give us an official UK perspective. Then we're delighted to hear from The Guardian's Washington-based World Affairs editor, Julian Borger, giving us an international perspective. And then we're very proud to hear from Kirsten Oswald. Kirsten is MP for East Renfrewshire. She's the SNP Deputy Leader in Westminster and Chair of Parliamentary CND. We'll then have the opportunity for Q&A, but before we do that, we'll hear very briefly from the Chair of the Nuclear Education Trust, Steve Barwick, one of the report's funders. So, great lineup this afternoon. Please do put questions in the box as you go along, and we'll come to them in the discussion time. So, first of all, Rebecca, well, congratulations on this incredible report. Please do introduce it to us.
Classic error at the beginning, isn't it? Thank you so much, Kate. And let me start by actually thanking you and CND and also NET, the Nuclear Education Trust, because it was your idea to come to me and ask me to do this just after the treaty was finalized and adopted in New York. And I felt I needed a bit more time to kind of weigh things up and think it through. And we've now got to hear and hear the report has come out. But we started with some fundamental questions that actually got stronger within the year after the treaty had been adopted. And that was a lot of criticisms arguing that the treaty didn't deal with things like verification, you know, and that it was just some kind of you know, it wasn't a real treaty was pretty well how they summed up. So I and others, particularly in ICAN and you know, lawyers and scientists, were starting to do some writing to look at that. And so I felt that, well, one of the things that we needed to do, because a lot of that kind of skepticism was coming up from the UK, was to pull that together and actually demonstrate, go through the treaty article by article with a commentary that drew from what different lawyers and scientists and diplomats and so on were actually saying about what the treaty does and what it means. And in that context, then it was, and well, let's look at what British nuclear policy actually is and how we came to this. And of course, as I was really deep in the writing, and the treaty had just entered into force last year, out came the UK integrated review, and then, you know, I had to sharpen the report quite a bit, but was very much helped by the fact that CND had commissioned a legal advice from Professor Christine Jinkin and Dr. Louise Aramatsu, precisely looking at it. You know, if you looked at the UK under its existing treaty obligations, you know, look at the integrated review and does it comply? So that was the first 2 chapters. But of course, the other question, the major question that was like the sort of elephant in the room was the politics and, in a sense, the ideology of those who were continuing to attach themselves and vote through Parliament and spend billions and billions of pounds on renewing, getting the next generation nuclear weapons, upgrading. And you know, what would change that? The question, you know, what would it actually take for changes in the UK, you know, the policy making changes? And so that became a really major part of my analysis, looking, you know, at what was driving Britain carrying on with nuclear weapons, because after all, we even had Sir Michael Quinlan telling us that, you know, that if Britain didn't have nuclear weapons, and this was back, I think he was speaking in 2006, we wouldn't actually be trying to get them now. The case for nuclear weapons pretty well had passed before 2006, when the vote was done to get the Dreadnought to carry Trident. So I looked at 5 scenarios, and initially I looked at them, you know, I sort of listened, you know, talked to a number of people and said, well, what would you see as the scenarios? And essentially we came to these 5 basic scenarios. And I think they cover, you know, what would be the major ways in which policy might change. But I want to stress they're not, you know, they're not consecutive, and they're different. And in a way, what they are feasible, but we don't know if they're likely, some more likely than others. But we start with the one that should be really the reason for the UK to have security policies, defense policies on anything, and that is what will keep us safe, the security case, and to tie that into the economic case, because, you know, you can't get gold-plated security if you can't afford it, and you need to think about what the balances are and really what are the security challenges of today. So it was to look at that first. Then the second of those, and of course I'm probably going to get them out of order now, but the second of those was looking at oh yes, well, the idea of another nuclear accident, a huge shock, or even a use of nuclear weapons, whether by accident or intention somewhere in the world. And that's the kind of shock theory. And that's one that, you know, we're often told is the only thing that would do it. The third one was if Scotland should vote for becoming nuclear free and independent. And we obviously have Kirsten here as a member of Parliament from Scotland to talk about that. But this was a very interesting one to look at, because actually a lot of scholars think this is possibly the most likely route to really put the kind of pressures and change the calculus. And then after that, we looked at the kind of idea that, well, the UK actually deep down knows it needs to get rid of nuclear weapons. It's trying to make a club with the other nuclear armed states, or at least 5 of them, that we call the NPT5, but they're also members of the Security Council, and that's all attached to status and those kinds of issues. But Britain's also part of NATO. And we all know clubbable behavior often means if your friends are doing something, it makes it more likely, more possible. It opens up the discussions a little bit more. So the fourth one was actually, okay, well, we know that there are a number of NATO states that are actually very interested in the treaty. Some even helped in the whole process, the humanitarian disarmament process that led to the treaty. So what would happen, or how could we get to the situation where a number of countries that currently have nuclear deterrence alliances with the US or through NATO were to decide that they actually wanted those security alliances to be nuclear free? What would that look like? And would that have an influence on the UK? And then finally is the one that we're often told is probably the only way we're going to do it, but we have to really question and recognize that a lot of factors come into that, which is the UK votes in elections. And we get governments that decide that they want to be nuclear free, and they therefore want not to spend the money on renewing Trident and so on. So those are the scenarios. And in some ways, I think that those are actually the most interesting part of the report. But it was necessary to have the really detailed analysis of the treaty and the and UK nuclear policy, because if we hadn't, we'd have people, you know, what I call the MEBAs, the military, industrial, bureaucratic, academic kind of networks or establishment, which we see in a country like the UK, we see it in the US, we see it in Russia, we see it in China. They're all a little bit different from each other, not so much, but they are the ones that kind of repeat everything until they all believe it. Fortunately, we have some, and we have a Julian Borger here who questions that. But we have to recognize that there is quite an establishment that is vested in keeping nuclear business as usual rolling forward. And so as long as that has the kind of hold it does, we're not actually going to get to where the people can vote in a government that is able to carry out nuclear disarmament. So these were the scenarios, and I think when it happens, it'll have some parts of all of them. So then, of course, I had to have a chapter. Well, what would nuclear disarmament look like? What would it take? And that I drew so heavily on the amazing work that people like John Ainsley from Scottish CND did. He really broke new ground in his report in 2012, and he worked on it after that. Sadly, he died in 2016, just very much missed, but also people like Peter Burt and Nuclear Information Service. And, you know, and I reached out to scientists who were working on nuclear disarmament and verification. I was hoping that a group of scientists from Princeton would write a chapter. They felt they weren't yet ready to do that in their research, but I think that they're doing a lot of very, very interesting analysis of how you could accomplish verifiable nuclear disarmament. And of course, the UK has its own projects on that, which I hope Aidan is going to be able to talk a little bit about. So then we come to the recommendations.
10 minutes, Rebecca.
So I'll just very quickly go through then the recommendations. So obviously, what I would like the recommendation to be is that the UK needs to sign and get rid of the nuclear weapons, join and contribute very constructively and positively to disarmament verification for the whole world. That's what I'd really like. But we have to live in the current world of 2022. And so what we've developed are 5 recommendations that are very practical that can be done now. And the first is that the UK actually has existing legal obligations under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. So the first is that it actually needs to take concrete steps along the steps that they actually adopted at the 2000 review conference of the NPT, known as the 13 steps, or the NPT Plan of Action for Nuclear Disarmament. They need to do that on all issues to do with nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation, and comply with Articles 1 and 6, that are the 2 key ones on them. The second is one really for the Westminster and Scottish Parliaments. And that's, now that the treaty's entered into force, in light of that, and taking into account the security and the economic situation that Britain finds itself in and the costs of the current policies, to have separate I think there needs to be separate Westminster and parliamentary investigations to determine what would be entailed in pursuing nuclear disarmament and in joining the TPNW. And I have recommendations suggesting, who to call on that. The third is to recognize that the first meeting of states parties is scheduled for Vienna. It's scheduled for this year. It's currently scheduled for March, but it may end up being postponed due to COVID. But nevertheless, the UK government should be there. It should apply as an observer, and it should be there. As things currently stand, Scotland cannot apply as a state to be there, but we know, and I hope again Kirsten's going to say something about this, there's members of parliament from Scotland, but also from all the parts of the UK, are going to go to the first meeting of states parties. We need to be there in the room. We need to listen to what's going on, and we need to think about ways in which the UK can get involved in a constructive way. Fourthly is something very much for civil society, and is recognizing that the treaty's provisions themselves are giving us a much clearer, much more practical toolbox for dealing with issues like divesting from nuclear weapons, of pushing for various kinds of defense diversification, for getting the banks and the investment companies basically to stop putting their money into producing nuclear weapons. And that applies to all the nuclear armed states, but of course that's here. And those are things that are actually happening now, but they need to be accelerated, and they can be accelerated with the tools we have from the treaty. And then fifthly is just a suggestion for the Scottish government, as I was actually on the very first Scottish government working group on Scotland without nuclear weapons that was convened in 2008 while I was still living up in Scotland, very close to Faslane. And I think it was very interesting. It brought together faith leaders and trades unions and academics and activists to look at what Scotland could be doing at this point. And that would be an interesting thing perhaps to think about again. And that's where I'll leave it.
Thanks very much indeed, Rebecca. That's really interesting, and it's good to have the summary there of the kind of action points that you recommend for taking forwards. And it would be very interesting to hear not only from our speakers about it, from the audience as well. So our next speaker is Aidan Liddle. Big welcome to you, Aidan, and thanks for joining us. As I mentioned earlier, Aidan is the UK's Disarmament Ambassador in Geneva. So over to you.
Thanks very much, Kate, and thank you very much for the invitation to speak. I mean, we should have been doing this as a side event to the NPT RevCon in New York, and I'm very disappointed not to be doing that. But it's really good anyway that we've got the opportunity to have this discussion today, even if the RevCon has to wait a little bit longer, although not too long, I hope. So and it's great to see so many people online as well, and I think that there is obviously great interest in this in this subject. And I was looking at the chat as it came up and seeing people from all over the UK and all over the world dialing in, and indeed from my own old neighbourhood in Queen's Park in London. So that was so hello to Queen's Park and to everyone back home. So I mean, I suppose that the starting point for me is to sort of say thank you to Rebecca for the report and for the introduction she's just given it. It's obviously a huge piece of work, and it's a labour of love as well as the result of a lot of very deep thinking. But I think, and I think it was very interesting as I was reading it yesterday to have a look through the sort of the commentary on the TPNW and the sort of the thought that's gone into that. I think I probably have two main reflections on the report itself before perhaps coming on to where the UK stands in this in this debate. The first thing was that I have to say I thought that although Rebecca said, she looked at what British nuclear policy is in preparing this report. I have to say, I think a lot of how British nuclear policy has been reflected in the report does rather misrepresent our position on various issues. I can run through some of the things that stood out to me, but I think it's important, if we're going to have a debate on this, we need to sort of establish some common ground on exactly sort of what our policy is and what role we see deterrence playing in the world. And I think that's really important, but perhaps I'll sort of come back to that a bit later. But I think it is important to say that deterrence for us is not just nuclear. I think it said somewhere in the report that we refer to it as the deterrent. We don't. The integrated review calls it the nuclear deterrent, and it's very clear elsewhere in the integrated review that deterrence is a toolbox with many tools in it, of which nuclear is one, reserved for very extreme threat to the UK and its allies. And I think it's really important to sort of hold on to that, because otherwise we do get into this sort of debate about what our policy actually is. But I'll perhaps come back to that a bit later. I think more importantly, the report for me set out some really interesting questions at the beginning. I think that on page 9 and page 10, there was a whole paragraph of questions. And I think there were some really interesting questions and some very good ones in there. I think, and the scenarios that Rebecca just set out, I think there are some very interesting elements in it, and particularly the first scenario, where it sort of hints at this idea that disarmament might be driven by the security environment. That is what we have said all along, and I regret slightly that the report didn't really engage with that question, because I think that again is where the different sides of this debate can actually have a more fruitful discussion. Because I think the point for me of the discussion so far, and of the report itself, has been this sort of focus on the UK. And in that sense, it came across as a slightly sort of parochial focus, if you don't mind me saying so, on what sort of UK unilateral disarmament would look like. Now, I think, obviously this question of unilateral disarmament's been out there for a very long time, but it's not got much traction, because I think everybody who thinks about what a world without nuclear weapons realizes is that this is going to be a process which doesn't just involve one country, and particularly, frankly, not just the UK. We are the smallest nuclear state out of the 5 recognized under the NPT. Unilateral UK disarmament, or even disarmament sort of, or NATO abandoning the sort of nuclear umbrella, is not going to make the world safe on its own. It will make the world less stable. It will damage our own security and that of our allies. But more importantly, from this point of view, it wouldn't actually lead to a world without nuclear weapons. And I think this is the difficulty. If you're looking at how to actually achieve a world without nuclear weapons, it has to be something that looks at what drives the possession of nuclear weapons across all the states that possess nuclear weapons or rely on nuclear deterrence for their security, why they rely on nuclear weapons for that ultimate deterrence. And starting from there, I think that's how you're actually going to get into a conversation about how to achieve that world without nuclear weapons. So this is very much the UK's focus. And if we had been at the RevCon, I would have already presented our working paper on getting to a world without nuclear weapons. It is up on the UN's website. It's working paper number 35, if you want to go and look at it. But I would commend it to you, because it's the first time, I think, that the UK, sort of the first time in a while, that the UK has set out its vision of how you get to a world without nuclear weapons. And I think it's worth dwelling on that a little bit, because what we do in that paper is to look at, as I say, the drivers for the possession of nuclear weapons and for the reliance on nuclear deterrence. And when we look at some of the factors that we would need to deal with if we were to get to that world without nuclear weapons. And the starting point is that the world without nuclear weapons has to be one that is more stable, more secure, and safer than the one we're currently in. And I think the worry of pursuing the sort of unilateral nuclear disarmament that the report focuses on is that it would make the world less safe, not more safe. So what are some of the things that we've been focusing on? Obviously, a lot of these sort of immediate steps are ones that are fairly familiar. Obviously, we talk a lot about the responsibility of the two largest nuclear powers to engage in arms control and restraint. We are increasingly focused, obviously, on China and the massive expansion of China's nuclear arsenal and what that means for the sort of the nuclear system. So that clearly, the dialogue between Russia and the US and involving China in that is clearly a massive issue and one that needs to be pursued urgently. We also talk about the necessity of negotiating a fissile material cutoff treaty. We talk about the importance of creating more nuclear weapon-free zones or even zones free of weapons of mass destruction and consolidating those that already exist and supporting those. We talk about verification, as Rebecca says Rebecca said in her introduction, but also in the report. This is something that the UK has done a lot of work on, and is extremely important because there will be no world without nuclear weapons without really cast iron techniques for verifying both the dismantlement and the continued absence of nuclear weapons. We talk about transparency and irreversibility. These are two terms that have been used a lot in the nuclear debate, but I think need more work and more understanding. I was troubled by what the report said about the UK having abandoned transparency, which couldn't be further from the truth. The UK is the most transparent of the nuclear weapon states. What we want to see is more transparency from others. And that will build the confidence that we all have and provide the baseline for reductions and the eventual elimination of nuclear weapons. And also, of course, non-proliferation. And while the world is faced with the nuclear program of the North Koreans and worries in Iran, obviously, these are very serious problems which do have a bearing on disarmament and vice versa. Something else that the UK has been particularly focused on, of course, is risk reduction as well. Now, this is not strictly speaking disarmament, but it is obviously important to reduce the risk of the use of nuclear weapons. And it's important to make sure that the nuclear weapon states and others are engaging in dialogue about understanding each other's doctrines as a way of reducing those risks. But I think the more interesting point about the working paper is actually the sort of the bit that looks further forwards. And what we say there is that a world without nuclear weapons will need to be preceded or accompanied by developments in political or military relationships which no longer rely on nuclear weapons to deter conflict. And I think this is a really important sort of a really important concept, and I think one that we do need to engage in very seriously. There are lots of problems sort of in the meantime. You have to address stability at low numbers. You have to avoid arms races in other areas as states try and compensate for or build up deterrence in other domains. But this idea that the world without nuclear weapons will rely on fundamentally different ways of managing disputes and managing conflicts, I think is one that's really fundamental. And I would welcome a much clearer focus on that and a much more sort of in-depth dialogue on that. Because the world without nuclear weapons is not simply this world without nuclear weapons. The world without nuclear weapons has to be constructed on very different lines. It has to be constructed on lines in which we rely on other means for deterring, for avoiding conflict, that we don't simply lower the threshold for conventional war inadvertently by reducing or removing the sort of the backstop, if you like, that the nuclear weapons provide in many countries' security doctrines. So I think these are some of the fundamental questions that I think we're prepared to engage in and we want to engage in. And I think it would be really interesting to have that sort of conversation with CND and with your members, moving away from the sort of the sole focus on what it would mean for the UK to dismantle weapons, but what would create the conditions in the world as a whole for all countries to dismantle their nuclear weapons, because after all, this is a common undertaking and a collective undertaking, and one that we remain committed to through the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. I'll leave it there because I know time is limited. I'm sure there'll be plenty of questions. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Aidan, and that's very interesting to get your perspective on the report and some of the wider issues. Just before I turn to Julian, I'm going to take Steve Barwick, Chair of NET, to make his quick remarks now, because I know you've got a family engagement that's pressing. I can see that. So please, so Steve is Chair of the Nuclear Education Trust, one of the funders of the report. Steve, over to you.
Well, thanks very much. Sorry, Omicron delayed my Christmas with my mother, so I have to take her out very shortly. But I did want to just very quickly welcome very warmly this report. I think it's a very insightful document, and it's asking a lot of really good questions, providing some insightful analysis, and has some useful recommendations. It's actually come at a very good time for NET, in the sense that we're just about to start considering properly commissioning some further research and reports. Delighted to have funded this, and clearly we need to dwell on what has been written here to really understand and make sure that we build on this, taking in light the various questions. I just merely add that obviously, following on from Aidan's comments, obviously the government is good that there is a debate. The Integrated Strategic Review seemed a very interesting document, but I did think it had some kind of conclusions that weren't necessarily the right ones, including more warheads, which I think can't sit right with what you were saying, or what we all, and certainly the report is saying. And I think the government did say there that they wanted red teaming, which I think is jargon for challenge. And I think that's in that spirit, NET will be building on this report and looking to do further work. And I think in the current political climate, geopolitical climate, there needs to be more focus and more education and information about diplomacy and disarmament, and perhaps less on rearmament and rhetoric. So hopefully we will carry on the good work after this. But thank you for being able to endorse the report.
Thanks very much indeed, Steve, and thanks to NET for its generosity and support. So moving now to our next speaker, Julian Borger, The Guardian's Washington-based World Affairs editor. Julian, over to you.
Thanks very much, and thank you for allowing me to participate. I recently had the experience that sort of drove home the sort of threat that we all live under. I took part in a VR, virtual reality simulation that was engineered by Princeton, American, and Hamburg universities. And what it did is it gave you the simulation of being US president, being ushered down into the Situation Room under a nuclear alert, incoming missiles on the early warning radar, and being given, by the time you get down there, about 12 minutes to make a decision about whether to launch the US arsenal. And you get down there, and on the table, the military aide holding the nuclear football put down three options, and the minimum was an option that involved an estimated 5 million casualties being caused, and the top was 45 million. So a pretty sobering experience. I decided not to launch, but I heard most people did launch the US missiles, many of them feeling, well, they had to do something, and they were being given very narrow options. My takeaways from it were, one, who was deciding on just these three options, and it opened up the question of how many decisions have already been taken by people in the Pentagon that will channel or funnel decisions made in the event of a crisis. And another takeaway, how chaotic it will be in a situation of a crisis. Dr. Strangelove really presents an optimistic picture because there are so many people in the room. In fact, the president may well be alone or one or two aides with him when this alert, if it comes. And the other I was really stunned to find out was that the only president to have done realistic drills on this was Jimmy Carter, who was a nuclear engineer himself and understood maybe a bit more. But the other presidents had just sent people along to tabletop exercises, or occasionally taken part themselves. So, it's particularly terrifying to think that Donald Trump might have been in that situation, but it's terrifying anyway that one person has sole authority to launch. That's not going to change. There's some legislation going through the Senate, but this administration is not going to dilute the powers of the president in that way. Joe Biden has said that he previously during the campaign and in the early stages of his presidency that he wanted to reduce the salience of nuclear weapons in US security. There's signs that he is going to lose that battle, that it's not enough of a priority for him to persevere. We don't know yet. It's a very decisive point at this moment because the nuclear posture review is going through the works. It's with the White House now, but it's been framed by the Pentagon. We know that he's not going to look at getting rid of one of the legs of the triad, the ICBMs, and will back a new ICBM, the GBSD, ground-based strategic deterrent. He was talking about reducing in terms of the doctrine, the parameters in which nuclear weapons would be used to go with sole use of nuclear weapons solely used against a nuclear attack. But from what we've heard, that the Allies, in particular France, have talked him out of that. And so what he may do is get rid of some of the extra weapons that Trump added on, but not really row back on the 1 trillion plus nuclear modernization that Obama signed off on. Earlier this week, the Bulletins of the Atomic Sciences unveiled their doomsday clock, as they do every year. And they decided to keep it at 100 seconds to midnight, keeping it the same as 2020 and 2021. And they said that was because there were some positive movements that counterbalanced all the drift towards the building up of nuclear arsenals, or the modernization of nuclear arsenals and proliferation, and the increased tensions. They didn't actually sound all that convinced of their own arguments. I mean, I wondered whether they had put together or made this decision before the Ukraine crisis had reached its present stage, and whether they wanted to leave themselves a bit of room or a bit of road, in terms of seconds to midnight for the years ahead. And what they did list as the positive things were that the Biden administration did agree to an extension, 5-year extension of the New START agreement with Russia. And there had been some strategic stability dialogues between the two countries, although in the most present round of those talks, it was all taken up by the Iran crisis and the Ukraine crisis. I'm sorry, and not the questions of getting back to arms control. Similarly, there are the early murmurings between Biden and President Xi of a strategic stability dialogue between those two countries. We don't know how far Xi is prepared to go with that, but at least it was a sign of another positive move, as was the 5 nuclear weapon states signing up to the Reagan-Gorbachev formula that nuclear war can't be won and should never be fought. And the nuclear weapon states were hoping to go into RevCom with that as a sort of offering in the absence of continued momentum to disarmament. But now RevCom, of course, has been postponed until August. The other positive point was JCPOA. JCPOA talks have resumed, but doomsday clock might look different if they did it in a month, because we've already heard from Tony Blinken, US Secretary of State, this morning, saying that they were prepared to give it another few weeks, to see if any real momentum could be made in moving forward in returning to the nuclear deal, because of the speed and the momentum of Iran's expansion of the program. They're now thought to have a 1 month breakout time, compared to 1 year as it was under JCPOA. So time is very much running out on the JCPOA talks. They're enriching to 20% and 60%, and you have the Israeli military again making sounds about making preparations to try and limit the Iranian program militarily. And that was pretty much it for the good news when it came to the doomsday clock. Obviously, there is a lot of bad news around. A lot depends on how Vladimir Putin sees his legacy. At the moment, he seems to see it in terms of territory rather than peace and economic growth. And the kind of wrecking policy that Trump brought to arms control during his tenure has proved fairly enduring, and has been protected, obviously, by the Republicans in the Senate, who are opposed to any movement towards arms control that Biden might pursue. Obviously, New START was the one thing that was rescued, and it was done because it could be done under executive order and didn't have to be submitted to the Senate. Doesn't seem to be much hope of getting back to the INF treaty. The US has raised it in the talks with Putin and Lavrov, but that would mean, well, the Russians don't seem to be interested in. They're interested in an end to NATO expansion and pulling back of new NATO forces, but also it would mean them admitting that they had a missile that that violated the INF, and they see no movement from them to do that they would be agree to something reciprocal that involved that admission. So both nuclear, by far the biggest nuclear states, US and Russia, are continuing with quite substantial nuclear modernization programs. We've seen Russia is developing has deployed the Avangard hypersonics, and is talking about a nuclear drone submarine, and Biden is sticking with, as far as we can tell, most of the Obama modernization plans, keeping the full triad. So
we've had 10 minutes.
Okay, I will wrap up. It's gone. Most of it is, similarly bleak. None of the other nuclear weapon states show at the moment any interest in disarmament. You have the beginnings of movement in Saudi Arabia in terms of their missile program, the very beginnings of a nuclear or a uranium processing program. At least there's evidence of that. So the risks of proliferation are high, and the prospects at the moment for disarmament seem really, really bleak. Biden has talked about the Ukraine situation, the dangers of the Ukraine situation getting out of hand. Lukashenko in Belarus has a constitutional amendment that is pushing that would allow Russian nuclear weapons to be based again in Belarus. So it's an incredibly fertile time for disarmament, but perhaps conversely, an opportunity for the advocates of the nuclear ban treaty to use the failure of the existing arms control framework and the crumbling of it to try and push for another way.
Thanks very much indeed, Julian. That's great. So, lots of nice, interesting questions coming into our Q&A box. So please keep them coming. And now it's a great pleasure to turn to our final speaker, Kirsten Oswald. Kirsten is MP for East Renfrewshire. She's also SNP Deputy Leader in Westminster and Chair of Parliamentary CND. Kirsten, big welcome, and over to you.
Thanks very much, Kate, and I would join you in welcoming everybody who's attending. It is really positive to see such large numbers of people on the virtual event here, and it has been fascinating to hear the speeches that have been delivered so far, and to give some thought to what's been said. I think there's a lot more thinking to do based upon what we've heard today, and I'm looking forward to the Q&A on the same basis. But I think that the Rebecca's report that we're launching today is really important. I think that it does remind us of a road that we've travelled down a long way, but as Julian has very eloquently laid out, we certainly have some way to go there when we try and think about how to rid the world of the threat of nuclear weapons. And I think that the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons must be an important milestone on the route to their elimination, and we've heard very clearly why that's so important. And I think that what Rebecca has set out actually is a vital source of information and arguments. It reminds us that over 50,000 nuclear weapons have already been dismantled and destroyed, and the remaining 13,000 are held by just 9 states. So if the UK was to cease to hold a nuclear arsenal, it would join the 95% of countries which already exist without such weapons. And I think what the report also does is to very powerfully undermine the argument that holding nuclear weapons makes the UK safer. Unless the UK is prepared to initiate an immoral and criminal nuclear response to some kind of non-nuclear threat, then these weapons are irrelevant militarily to the day-to-day security of the UK. And, that's, I think, a discussion that we could and should labour on as much as possible. The problem is, I guess, the sad fact is that the UK's adherence to its status as a nuclear power is a throwback to a bygone age. It's one that the current UK government does, however, seem rooted to, and that's perhaps part of its own ideological vision of what Great Britain or global Britain as they see it should be. I think perhaps it feels a bit like nothing's been learned since 1962, when Dean Acheson, the former US Secretary of State, said, "Great Britain has lost an empire and not yet found a role. The attempt to play a separate power role, that is a role apart from Europe, a role based on a special relationship with the United States, is about to be played out." And if only somebody had told the European Research Group to do their research. They've basically taken Britain back down a well-worn path, but it's one that leads to a dead end. And in the ERG version of the world, Britain's nuclear arsenal is a key to a seat at the top table. But actually, in reality, it's a millstone around the neck of the UK's military. It diverts funding, it diverts capacity away from their day job, and it leaves armed forces personnel in a very difficult position where they need to try and use resources that are not sufficient to the day job that they're trying to do. So if the UK really did want to be a global leader, then perhaps it should look more seriously at its own paper commitment to nuclear non-proliferation, halt the expansion in the number of nuclear warheads. And I thought it was fascinating earlier on to hear an argument for an extended number of nuclear warheads as somehow being part of a road to a nuclear-free world. And for me, that simply doesn't square. But I think that any steps from the UK in terms of disarmament would send a really powerful message to other countries to stop spending money on weapons that will, as we see it, never be used. And I think that the quote from Dean Acheson also reminds us of how the UK became tied to nuclear weapon systems that make it very much a junior partner to the USA. Because having exhausted its capacity to maintain an independent nuclear capability, the UK looked to America for help. And that's how we ended up with the American-dependent submarine-based Polaris missile system, which was housed at Faslane, not too far from where I'm sitting in my house, actually, just a few miles along the River Clyde, and the Americans' nuclear submarine base at the Holy Loch also, which had been made available in return for American help. And the arrival of these two bases has played a really fundamental role in shaping Scottish politics, and that's continued to play a part in shaping Scottish politics for more than half a century now. So although the American base is now gone and Polaris is also long gone, and the UK is moving on to a third generation of nuclear missile carrying submarines, and we all know the eye-watering cost of that, there is no way to take this debate out of Scottish politics and out of Scottish discourse. The sidelining of the concerns of people in Scotland about this concentration of nuclear weapons just a stone's throw from our biggest city has created an impact that will, I think, continue to be felt in our politics for a long time. Because all the evidence that we can see tells us that these weapons are housed in Scotland despite the opposition of the people in Scotland, because on a consistent basis, Scottish civic society, the Scottish Trade Union Congress, Scotland's churches, the Scottish Parliament, and the vast majority of Scotland's MPs oppose nuclear weapons. And Scotland's local authorities are also joining the many towns and cities and countries and federal states around the world that are passing or have passed resolutions, usually on a cross-party basis, and that's something that perhaps we could come back to in support of the TPNW, or calling for council pension funds to divest from both fossil fuels and nuclear weapons. And I think that Rebecca's report and the way that it's framed, asking the questions that it does, will help us, I think, to accelerate that discussion, and I think that that's really important. And of course, the Scottish Government has a long-standing position of opposition to the possession, to the threat, and to the use of nuclear weapons. And the Scottish Government has condemned nuclear weapons as morally, strategically, and economically wrong. And again, I would go back to the report, which does show that this is a distinct discussion that we have here. And I think it's one that's really important to try and extend. And Scottish ministers have expressed strong support for the principles of the TPNW and urged the UK government to sign. So there is that stark contrast in approach in terms of Scotland, where the UK nuclear arsenal is housed, but where we are prevented from signing up to the TPNW, and that of independent Ireland, whose leadership role was critical in the development and ratification of the treaty. And I was interested in the section of the report which talks about independence. Of course, I would be interested in that with my political beliefs, but I think that it's undoubted that an independent Scotland will be a keen signatory of the treaty. And I would encourage everyone who is keen on trying to make a change in the UK stance on nuclear weapons to factor that into your calculations on the way forward, because change is certainly coming here. And Scotland's First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, joined CND before she joined the SNP. So I think that perhaps speaks to the depth of feeling in Scotland and the long-standing concerns that we have here. Indeed, when she was asked a time ago about a possible coalition government at Westminster, she actually made it clear that scrapping Trident would be a requirement for the SNP in participating in any coalition. Obviously, in reality, it's unlikely that such a coalition would actually get off the ground, because Westminster is so focused on a macho punching above our weight UK culture, instead of focusing on things that can actually make a difference. And I have to say, I much prefer the First Minister's approach to focusing on priorities. And when she was asked if she would use nuclear weapons, she said she had a moral objection to weapons of mass destruction, and that she would not be prepared to press a nuclear button that might kill tens of millions of people. So if I could borrow another phrase from Dean Aitchison, he said, "There'll be no learning period with nuclear weapons. Make one mistake and you'll destroy nations." And I'm going to be thinking, I think, for a long time about what Julian said to us this afternoon, because I think that demonstrated that whole point very, very starkly. And the report goes on to highlight American records on the use of non-nuclear drones in terms of revealing patterns of failure there, which have caused the death and injury of many civilians, including women and children. And of course, the people who control these drones are just people just as those who are in control of the nuclear weapons are. And we heard about the pressure that, of course, would exist if you were in that decision-making situation. So reality tells us that errors and miscalculations can occur to any of us at any time. And I think that that's one of the key points that we need to really try and focus governmental minds on when they're thinking about nuclear weapons, not only about when they can never be used, which in my book is never, but also why such a dangerous and a dangerous and unchangeable weapon should ever be part of an armoury at all. And I guess that if I'm moving to a conclusion, that some of the things that really strike me are that Rebecca's report drives home the message that we're not on a linear path to nuclear disarmament. Part of Trump's legacy is the loss of the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, and part of Boris Johnson's legacy is an increase in the number of UK warheads, which of course is contrary to its treaty obligations. And that has made Scotland once again an unwilling accomplice in the storage of these. So people in Scotland, and I hope that people across the UK too, are increasingly clear that money spent on Trident leaves large gaps in the defence budget. It means that we are paying a price in terms of jobs. The MOD's own figures show that while the MOD is prepared to spend so much, such eye-watering sums on Trident renewal, they're cutting defence jobs in Scotland. And I think that the report's recommendation, and we heard about this at the very beginning of the session, to look further at the work carried out by the Scottish Government Working Group on a Scotland without nuclear weapons, could help us to find a way forward more broadly. And I'm sure Rebecca would have a view on that as a former member of the group. I know that she may share the frustration of the chair, Bruce Crawford, at the limitations that the group faced at some points because of the split of reserved and devolved powers. But whether these frustrations or the other frustrations and barriers we've heard about today, I think that we must persist in trying to find ways to discuss this and trying to pin down some of the real concerns and the reasons why this is so problematic. And I think that that's a pretty clear message that comes through today. And I would absolutely encourage people to have a look at the report. It's set out in a way that makes it entirely possible to look at the different sections and not be overwhelmed by the amount of information there. So I've no doubt that we will have a significant degree of discussion about that ongoing in months to come. And I would really welcome that. But I think that's probably time for me to stop and hear from the Q&A. So thanks again, Kate.
Thanks very much indeed, Kirsten. That's really interesting, and you've got a lot of very positive feedback in the chat there. Okay, so there's a lot of questions in the box. I think not surprisingly, given the nature of our audience, there's quite a few of them that are particularly being put to Aidan. Good, you're there. So what I'm going to do to try and facilitate a good flow of discussion is to put 2 or 3 of those questions to you directly first. And then if you could try and answer briefly, if possible. We've only got about half an hour left. And then I'll field some of the other questions to the rest of the panel. And of course, you can add in there as well if you want to, Aidan. So first of all, just a few highlights for Aidan. I'm not going to get the opportunity to ask all of them, I don't think. But David Cullen, who is from the Nuclear War was from NIS. He said, I'd like to ask Aidan to justify his statement that the UK is the most transparent of the nuclear weapons states. The US releases hundreds of pages of document on its nuclear weapons programme every year. The UK won't even publish the one-word delivery confidence assessment for the nuclear warheads capability sustainment programme. So that's a question for you there on transparency. And then there are a few around the question of, it says, a point which you made I found surprisingly in contradiction with the government's view is your assertion that unilateral nuclear disarmament by Britain would make us less safe. So there's a set of questions around that. And then also from Paula Shaw, I would like Aidan to expand on how nuclear weapons resolve conflicts. So you can see those kinds of issues, which I think, we're sending alarm bells to our CND supporting people in the audience. So if you could just quickly have a go at those, and then I'll raise some of the broader questions to the panel.
Thank you. Well, excellent questions as always. I'll give it a go. So on transparency, I think what I mean by this is that the UK is the only country that publishes a figure for its overall stockpile of nuclear weapons. Now, we don't publish the exact number as it stands on a day-to-day basis, but we do publish the limit beyond which our stockpile will never grow. That limit has obviously gone up from 225 to 260. That's what was announced in the integrated review. I was interested actually in the table on page 14 of the report, which showed that actually that's that several others have grown much faster than that, China, India and Pakistan amongst others. And of course, as I say, we still have the smallest arsenal of all of the nuclear weapon states under the NPT. So what we publish is that overall stockpile limit number, which no other nuclear weapon state does. We say exactly what our capabilities are. It's very easy because we've only got one, unlike all of the other nuclear weapon states. We just do one delivery system, which is the Trident missile on board the 4 nuclear submarines. The capabilities of those submarines are very well known as well. So essentially, our nuclear capabilities are there for all to see. We don't hide anything on that. Now, all of the other nuclear weapon states have a different approach to transparency. The US publish a lot of data, as the questioner was saying, as does France. Russia publishes data on its strategic nuclear weapons because they're required to under New START, but they don't publish anything at all on their on the so-called sub-strategic weapons, which are a much larger, we think, part of their arsenal. And China publishes absolutely nothing at all. So on that base, it's on that basis which I say that the UK is the most transparent. Now, that doesn't mean to say, of course, that we can say absolutely everything. There are, of course, lots of things about nuclear weapons which have to remain secret. That's partly because the technology itself is secret. We have obligations under the NPT not to share knowledge and technology and technical information that would allow others to build nuclear weapons. We also, of course, have various pieces of information that would be very useful to our adversaries, which we don't particularly want to share with them. So there is always this trade-off between what you can say and what we can't say. But I think by and large, we try and say as much as we can. And I think we also try, and where we can't say something, we try and say why we can't say something. And I think that the UK National Report sets that out as well. On the sort of, why do I say unilateral disarmament would make us less safe? So, I mean, obviously the UK the country faces an extraordinary range of threats to its livelihood, its way of life. As people have said, things like climate change and global health threats, as well as military ones. You know, the integrated review is a very long document which doesn't say very much about nuclear weapons, but it says an awful lot about the sort of range of threats that we're facing and the different sort of tools, economic, military, technological, diplomatic, which we have to try and deter or mitigate those threats. As I say, nuclear weapons are designed to deter only a very, very small subset of those threats at the very extreme end. Nobody pretends that nuclear weapons are going to deter climate change or pandemics or cyber attacks by terrorists or whatever. That's not the point of them. Why do I say that getting rid of them unilaterally would make them would make us less safe? It's simply because NATO relies on the US and UK strategic deterrent as the sort of the underpinning of its sort of military security. It's the sort of the continued existence of the states that make up NATO. And if we were to get rid of ours without Russia and other adversaries getting rid of theirs, that obviously leaves the door open to nuclear coercion. And we see what's happening in Ukraine at the moment, and the threat and likelihood and results of that sort of coercion are all too clear. And I don't need to spell that out, I don't think. How do nuclear weapons resolve conflicts? Well, it's a good segue, really, isn't it? So, I mean, nuclear weapons are not designed to resolve conflicts. They're designed to prevent conflicts from starting in the first place. And again, this is a very, very important important thing to say, and it sort of underpins what the Reagan-Gorbachev formula, as Julian described it says as well. You know, nuclear wars cannot be won and must never be fought. The whole point of nuclear weapons is that wars are never fought in the first place, because the consequences of those wars, as we all know, would be horrific. And I think what the point is that those alliances, those countries that depend on nuclear weapons for their security, are able to say, if anybody else wants to threaten the existence of our states, then, you know, we have recourse to this weapon as a deterrent. Now that deters those wars from breaking out in the first place. And what I often say is that, you know, the world without nuclear weapons can't just be the world of 1914 or 1939, where, particularly 1914, you know, where sort of limited conventional crises sort of escalate and get out of control. Nuclear weapons stop that happening. And certainly in the sort of current security paradigm. And that's why I say that any world without nuclear weapons has to deal with what replaces nuclear weapons to prevent conflict. Is it something political? Is it something legal with the necessary enforcement? Is it something technological? I mean, these are very important questions that we need to grapple with, and I think get lost in this debate. But the point is, nuclear weapons since 1945 have stopped major power conflict breaking out into another world war. And I wouldn't want the world without nuclear weapons to be the world of 1914, where that is no longer the case. Thanks.
Okay, thanks very much, Aidan. So now I'm going to go to the rest of the panel with a series of questions. First of all, from Tony Conway, does the panel have a view on how nations not in NATO or on the Security Council, P5 in other words, will take steps to nuclear disarmament? And then from Pauline Fraser, what importance do panelists attach to the increasing number of cities around the world that have declared themselves nuclear free? From Rosemary Steele, what constructive suggestions have been made for the redeployment of manpower and money as fears of unemployment make people resist change? I guess that's the kind of Trident and jobs question. And then a slightly broader, perhaps more philosophical question from Diana and Nick Francis. Why should an arbitrary group of nuclear weapons states be the judges of the security benefits or otherwise of nuclear weapons for global security? And then one specifically on the treaty itself. The treaty includes provision for remediation for the impacts of nuclear weapons testing. How would this affect the UK, given our history of nuclear weapons testing in Australia and elsewhere, particularly on First Nations lands? So a nice range of things there. Which of my remaining panelists would like to go first on that? Rebecca, over to you.
I'll take a stab at it since I've been very quiet ever since.
Can you do that in 5 minutes?
I'll try to. I was tempted to respond to some of the points that Aidan made, but everybody in the chat really has dealt with a lot of that. So I'll respond to these questions that you raised, because I think they are very interesting. We always refer to the nuclear, and throughout the report I refer to the nuclear armed states because there are 9, and it actually it addresses some of that, the underlying issues of the question from, I think, Diana, about why should we be having these 5 nuclear armed states kind of controlling the security of the world. And of course, this is a legacy of war. It's the legacy of the Second World War, that it's that particular 5, and that particular 5 also drove to get the first nuclear arsenals before then it became possible to at least get the Non-Proliferation Treaty. And so this is a structure of colonialist and frankly patriarchal and war-fighting nations controlling what then it fairly quickly went into being a Cold War, so-called, but it was only a Cold War for some of us in Europe and a few other places where the wars weren't fought directly, although weapons were deployed. That's why I went to Greenham Common, because those were weapons being deployed that were intended to fight war. But wars were taking place all around the world by proxy. We have to really understand that this is the context. And I do want to say that it's part of the context that absolutely underlay the whole of this report, because as Aidan absolutely rightly said, and I have been saying for a long time, I've said it at NATO meetings going back to at least 2010 and others when I would speak in detail about some of these issues, when I used to be invited to them, which is a world without nuclear weapons cannot be this world just without nuclear weapons. But we have to turn that around and also say, and we can't transform this world as it needs to be transformed for peace and security without the steps that are getting rid of nuclear weapons within the kind of context that the TPNW, the Nuclear Ban Treaty, actually creates, which is both setting out all the prohibitions of all the activities that could lead to a nuclear use, or lead, in fact, to the threats of nuclear use, because that's effectively what nuclear deterrence actually is. And then it sets out the provisions and the manner in which all of the nuclear armed states, and also those we call nuclear endorsing states or nuclear dependent states, who don't possess nuclear weapons, but they do collaborate with their deployment in various different kinds of ways. The treaty sets out the basic principles and objectives for how that's going to be done. And as the treaty starts meeting the states parties, they will build all the flesh onto the bones of those principles. And that's really important. That's why the UK should be there as an observer if we're not yet ready to sign. And we clearly are not yet ready. So as Tony Robinson, I think, said in the chat, again, absolutely right, we do have to turn this round. The very possession of nuclear weapons is an obstacle to us moving into a world that is actually able far more effectively to collectively tackle climate destruction and even COVID. And it's an obstacle to us putting the kind of resources into energy that will not destroy the earth, into a way of living that will not destroy the earth, into tackling poverty, into growing the kind of health resources that are needed all over the world, not just in the rich countries, but all over the world. And, living within our means globally, if you like. And that means changing how we do things in this country. We can't carry on working at the level of weaponry and the reliance, the military industrial reliance of the UK and actually of most, if not all, of the other nuclear armed states is far, far higher than the countries that are not pouring money and dependent on nuclear weapons. So these are the changes that have to be made. It doesn't all happen overnight, and it's ridiculous to suggest, but I'm afraid that Aidan's suggestion about some of the steps is still harking back to steps controlled by those who have the nuclear weapons. And what changed with the Ban Treaty was that the non-nuclear countries actually, for the very reasons that one of the questions was saying, why have we put in things like, remediation? Because nuclear weapons have caused the most appalling humanitarian catastrophes. Everywhere they were used, that's Hiroshima and Nagasaki directly in Japan, and tested, which was a form of use of nuclear weapons as things were being tested, contaminated the lands of, as the person who asked that question said, indigenous people. That's why that's such an important part of the treaty, that it will deal with those issues, and those are responsibilities that the UK, as a nuclear armed state that conducted that nuclear testing on Western Shoshone land, Greenham used to do some stuff, well, is now doing more stuff on that, across the Pacific, on Aboriginal land, Maralinga in Australia. But all of the 9 nuclear armed states have contaminated indigenous lands in order to get their nuclear weapons. They all have to be responsible, but we all do.
Thanks up, Rebecca.
Okay, I can't answer the rest of the questions, sorry, but they were very good questions.
Just got to give everyone a bit of a go on this. So Julian, would you like to go next? So have a go at any of those questions? Unmute.
Sorry. I know I was going to say, I don't think they're for me. I think they're policy questions and not really sort of, when it comes to descriptive of the international scene.
Oh, okay. I mean, is there, as we're sort of into the last segment of the meeting now, is there any kind of more general points you'd like to throw in there, or things that have come up?
I mean, I just looking through the questions that I can see on the Q&A there. I mean, there's one that maybe that I can have a go at. That's from Tom Cuthbert about what the evidence is for Chinese expansion, and it's a good question to ask. And we have assertions that from the US that they're going to quadruple and be over 1,000 by 2030. Unclear, whether those have a solid base at all. What is true is that the Chinese arsenal is a tiny fraction of the size of the Russian and the US, and that's what underlies the Chinese reluctance to get drawn into trilateral dialogue with US and Russia, and why it is very, very nervous about being drawn into arms control.
Okay, thanks very much, Julian. Okay, so now we've got a little bit more time now. I apologise for cutting you off, Rebecca. Aidan, are you likely to want to come back in again, or have you had your say now?
Oh, I could talk all afternoon about this stuff, but perhaps Kirsten wants to go first. I've had a go already.
Okay, thanks very much. Kirsten, then I'm going to let you have full reign now on that, and then I'll come back to Rebecca at the end for some concluding remarks. But before I do that, I've been reminded, please, everybody, if you feel like making a donation to CND's funds to help with this kind of work and our whole range of activities, please do feel free to do so. Sarah, my colleague, has put a nice little link there in the chat. So if you feel like making a donation, please do so. And thank you in advance. Kirsten, over to you.
Thank you, Kate, and well said. I'm sure you'll find a link on the website if you don't catch the one on the chat. So I don't know where to go first with all of this. I thought it was really interesting, the range of questions. I'm not sure I'll do them entirely the justice that Rebecca did, but I might come at them from slightly a different angle there and try and pull out some of the threads. So I thought that there were two questions actually, which I thought were not connected, but maybe we should connect them in our own minds. And that was the question about cities which are nuclear free, and the question about why those, I'm trying to read my own writing, with nuclear weapons get to make decisions for those who don't. And I think that all of that actually comes back down to one principle, really, in terms of the views of people on the ground and how that is lost so often in this kind of dialogue. And I should perhaps at this point just say hello and mention the fact that my colleague Bill Kidd, MSP, is on this call, and I'm just absolutely delighted by that, because Bill is such a huge ambassador for nuclear disarmament and does just an incredible power of work. And I think that he really exemplifies that sort of grassroots focus. And it strikes me anytime that I have a discussion about this, that the views of people, whether, where I am in East Renfrewshire at the moment, or much further afield, are lost in this whole dialogue. And if they were taken into account, if we had, and why don't we, if we had this discussion with the population at large, I feel that things would be very different, whether that that be at home or overseas. And that, I think, is the big missing link. It's something that is being done to us. It's something that is done to people, and that strikes me as not right. And it makes me reflect again on that example that Julian gave us of his tour to the red button, if you like, and how everything happens and it's filtered down into this one decision point without the kind of protections and consideration that you would think would be absolutely vital in all of that. And I guess that the other question that I really wanted to look at was the redeployment one, because I think that when you have that conversation with people, as we should do, then one of the key things that we need to do is to be transparent. We need to have a serious conversation about what that means, and that's lost in my experience in an awful lot of the dialogue about this. I've had this discussion, as you might imagine, being a Scottish politician, with those who have different political views to mine. Now, you know, it's perfectly respectable for people to have different political views, but we need to have a serious discussion about these things. And some of the figures and numbers that are thrown about are not credible. So I think that we absolutely have to embrace the fact that we can have a constructive dialogue about this. Think of the discussions that go on and are quite new in terms of the public nature of the discussions about the fact that we need to redeploy people from traditional oil-based industries, for instance, in Scotland, to renewables industries. This is the same discussion that we need to have in terms of nuclear weapons and in terms of the jobs and skills situation. It is absolutely and entirely possible for us to make a move from a nuclear facility to a move to a different kind of facility, whether that be a conventional military facility or some other. But until we get to a point where we are actually having this discussion and trusting the public to be part of it, then we're not going to get very far in all of that. So it does strike me, I think, in all of these questions, that one of the underlying issues is that the politicians, and I appreciate I'm one of them, so, you know, I take the hit on that, are talking about this without bringing the public into it. And wherever we are, I think that we do an awful lot better in making these decisions if we actually trusted some of that discussion to the people who would, of course, be directly affected.
Thanks very much indeed, Kirsten. I mean, there's a huge amount to be thinking about there. So thanks very much indeed for that. I can just, I don't know if people have noticed it in the chat, if people want to take this discussion forward next week. There's a contribution from Janet Fenton from Scottish CND. She says, if people read the report over the weekend, they may wish to join Scottish CND on Monday, the 24th at 5:30, when Rebecca will be taking questions on it. And there's an email address there if you wish to get involved. So please do find that in the chat. So Rebecca, then over to you for your final concluding remarks, and point us the way to go on the activism, please.
Well, thank you very much. And I just want to say the framing, the reason for why we're concerned about nuclear weapons are really, in the very first sentence of the executive summary says, nuclear weapons continue to threaten the world with nuclear war and terror. In effect, nuclear war is just an accident away, you know, miscalculation or mistake by a petulant leader. You know, that's how close it still is with 13,000 nuclear weapons. And the opening, excuse me, the opening of the introduction, I think, also brings it into, as humanity is now struggling to address the enormity of what we must change to avoid further deadly pandemics and the worst outcomes of climate destruction, nuclear risks and the spectre of nuclear war are on the rise again. And those really are kind of the where we're not underestimating the challenges. I'm not underestimating. When you read the report, you will see that I really try to look into them. But, you know, I actually think we do have to be making the fundamental changes now, and getting rid of nuclear weapons is part of that fundamental change to make the kind of world that doesn't blow itself up and actually manages somehow to roll things back on climate destruction before our children and grandchildren inherit a world where climate is a runaway danger and they can't handle it at all. And those are the things that we have to be dealing with now. And so that's the appeal with the report, is both to say we need to reclaim the notion of security. We need to rethink it, and rethinking security is, of course, a very good group of people looking into these kinds of things. We need to have a better informed public conversation about what security actually means for us in this country, on these islands and around the world, because we are contributing massively to the insecurity of nations and peoples around the world. That's why it was the non-nuclear countries that finally said, we can't keep waiting for the nuclear armed countries. It's like waiting for the drug addicts to choose not to be carrying on profiting, but by getting kids to sell the drugs and you know, use them. And so it doesn't work that way. That isn't how the world works. We actually have to be starting to make those changes ourselves and recognize the ways in which we are part of the obstacles. We're part of the problem. Nuclear weapons do not make us safe, and they cannot actually help us. We can't hang on to them while we're trying to change the world into a world without nuclear weapons, peace and security, as Obama said. We have to be building that peace and security in parallel with getting rid of nuclear weapons. And the multilateral UN negotiated treaty is the legal instrument. It builds on the NPT, which the UK is a state party of, but it builds on it in all kinds of ways that needed to happen. And the UK is being left behind and is hanging on and can't actually change British, our own security while it's hanging on to the nuclear weapons. And that's really very much what we want. So I just want to leave you, and my final point here is the cities one, because I think this is it's exciting and positive, and it's part of what I put into the recommendations too, that, ICAN issued the cities appeal and also a parliamentary pledge and various things that would involve local authorities, elected representatives, and so on. It was, exciting to actually work with councillors here where I live in Brighton and Hove and get Brighton and Hove to declare itself as a nuclear-free city and align itself with a treaty. New York was one of the most recent, and not just aligned itself with a treaty, but in very practical ways required education on nuclear weapons issues in a very concrete way and required divestment from nuclear weapons. Cities have, a lot of towns and cities and local authorities, they have pension funds, unions have pension funds that invest in nuclear weapons. So there's a lot that citizens can do, getting your cities along. Manchester's already there, Edinburgh, Glasgow, Bangor in Wales, but a lot more, and it's not difficult. And MedAct has got a kit on their website. Nuclear-free local authorities do quite a lot of this. And on divestment, I just want to draw your attention to Don't Bank on the Bomb, where again, there is a good kit through MedAct. Don't Bank on the Bomb, again, an initiative with ICAN that we can all pick up with and run, but also a church-based network here called the Nuclear Weapons Financing Research Group that I talk about in the report. Has really done some good research and good work. This is something that all of us can get directly involved with, move the money out of nuclear weapons and into green and sustainable energy and alleviation of poverty and the health resources and the education resources that we desperately need more investment in. My final thing is, let's just create a much better conversation around these issues. Let's not keep talking about this unilateral versus multilateral. The TPNW is a multilateral treaty that requires that every state that has nuclear arms or depends on nuclear arms takes its own national decisions on how to start complying with that. That's both, and that's how it always was actually, and that's how it always is going to have to be. And civil society has got such a major role in pushing our governments and our local authorities and our investors and everyone else, the parliamentarians, towards recognizing that it's in our hands to get rid of nuclear weapons all over the world. But we have to start where we live and with the weapons on our soils, going through our seas.
Thank you very much, Rebecca. Well, resounding, and I'm sure we all echo those sentiments. So thank you very much indeed. Thank you for your marvellous report. And anyone, well, most people won't have had a chance to look at it yet, but it's there on our website. So please do look at that and get involved in whatever way you can. So a big thank you to our speakers. Thank you very much, Aidan, for joining us today, and to you, Julian. Hope the weather's a bit better over there in Washington. Maybe not, I don't know. And Kirsten, of course, thank you so much for finding the time from your parliamentary schedule to join us today and giving us the perspective from Scotland. So thanks to our speakers, but above all, audience, thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. Thank you for the questions and discussion, and thank you for all your work for nuclear disarmament. And we'll carry on working together until we achieve that goal. So bye-bye, everybody. Have a lovely weekend and take care.